Hello and welcome to Hamilton the Podcast. I'm Vinton Bayne.
And I'm Robbie Hurlocker.
Today we have a very special Intermission episode for you, our $10 Founding Father number 10 episode, actually.
Yeah, so if you want to get up and go to the concession stands, buy an overpriced bottle of wine or something.
We don't have that for sale. We're a podcast. You can go down to the general store, I guess.
Right.
Yeah, enjoy.
Seriously,
pause
though.
the podcast.
Yeah, pause the podcast. Seriously, though, alcohol on Broadway is very ridiculously expensive. I asked the guy, is it really worth $15 for this thing? He just gave me a look like he wasn't allowed to answer that question. It was silly, but...
So in this episode, we're going to tell a few different stories here, but we're going to start off with the song that is left out of the Broadway cast recording. And that's Tomorrow There'll Be More of Us.
Yeah, this is the scene where we get to learn about John Lawrence's death in South Carolina.
Right.
This song is entitled Tomorrow There'll Be More of Us, which is an obvious allusion to the earlier tavern scene and the reprise of the story of tonight, when you get to see the men have made this their creed, their announcement, their declaration of allegiance to the cause, where they announce their own dedication to the war.
Yeah, and it's more than just the title that shares something with those songs. Actually, here you have John Lawrence on the stage singing lines from Story of Tonight. He starts off with, I may not live to see our glory, and it's going to be very telling because this is the song where Hamilton finds out that he was killed.
Yeah, and that's really heartbreaking to give that lyric so much depth of meaning, to say that, like, we've been singing this, I may not live to see our glory. It's kind of this far off, distant thing. A lot of young men think that when they go off to war, they're young and invincible, and they're not actually going to die, and they might say things like, I may not live to see our glory, but here we get to have that specific reality of war highlighted, that they really may not live to see the glory that comes from this battle, and John Lawrence is proof that there were not always happy endings, and there were always casualties of war.
Right. So Lin-Manuel Miranda chose to leave this out of the recordings because he said when he was growing up, he loved musicals and he listened to a lot of cast recordings, and there was always stuff left out of those. While Hamilton, most of it is there, he did want to leave something out because he said when he would go and see these Broadway performances later, those parts that were left out were revelations to him. They were this beautiful thing to behold, and they just opened up everything with new light. And he wanted something like that for listeners of his show. And overall, he also mentioned it's more of a scene and less of a song.
Right. This is the most spoken piece of the entire musical as far as the different tracks go. Everything else is either rapped lyrics back and forth, rapped dialogue, or sung dialogue.
Yeah. So the staging here, you have Hamilton busy at work, and then his wife, Eliza, comes in and says that he has a letter. And at this point, I think that Lawrence is over to the side and everything's dark. There's like a spotlight on Hamilton and his wife. And then there's a separate, I think, blue colored or some kind of colored light on Lawrence, specifically separated from them a little bit. It gives an ethereal look to it. And she mentions he has a letter. And he's like, oh, I'll read it later. It's from Lawrence. That's fine. I'll read it later. And he's like, no, it's from his father. And you see this concern grow on his face. He's gone from being excited. They've won the war. It's done. Yes.
Yeah.
To this, oh no, what is about to happen?
Yeah, you can almost tell just immediately that situation is heavy. It's grave. It is a somber moment where it's not his best friend just sending him a random, hey, what's going on letter. This is something from his best friend's father, who hasn't had that type of correspondence with him on the past. He knows something is up. He knows something has to be wrong. And
historically, we don't have any evidence that it was his father that wrote him that letter to inform him of the death. But 3 years after Lawrence had died, we do have a letter of correspondence between Henry Lawrence, his father, and Hamilton.
That's right.
And they were talking about the feeling of losing a child. And he says, as for happiness, since receiving the wound to which we have alluded, ever green, I have learned to be at least half happy by a quiet submission in every moment.
Now, if this is 3 years after John Lawrence died, was that before or after Philip Hamilton actually died in the duel?
Interestingly enough, I had thought that this was two gentlemen talking about losing a child, but it turns out the letter was written quite a bit before Philip would die in the duel.
Right. And so that's interesting, because here you have Hamilton talking with the father of his best friend, who's confiding in him about what it is to lose a child. And you have to kind of wonder whether Hamilton's going to gather enough wisdom from that moment and hold on to those nuggets of truth for later in his life when he actually has to go through the same thing. Maybe he thinks back to some of the advice that Henry Lawrence gives to him. Maybe he sees that and he has that nugget of wisdom to fall back on.
Yeah, and I like this phrasing used here, this evergreen, basically saying that it's ever current, it's ever fresh. It's just like it happened yesterday, even today, 3 years ago. This is a thing that never goes away.
Right. In dealing with grief and trauma and counseling and such, we always talk about the new normal and how hard it is to get used to your new normal, because after you have a loss, there is a grieving period and you don't know what the new thing in your life will be. But suddenly, after a while, that becomes normal again. And it's not the same, and it's not something that ever leaves you, but you eventually get used to the new normal, and things have changed, and your whole paradigm has shifted, and something as big as this would leave a scar that would never actually go away.
So in the lyrics, you see that Hamilton is informed by Lauren's father through a letter that Lawrence has been killed in battle. And technically, the war was over, like Parliament had been conceded it, but there were still skirmishes going on around. And it would be another year after this, after his death, that the Treaty of Paris would be signed and things would be officially over.
Right. Between the Battle of Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris, there were a lot of really dangerous things that still came up, like we talked about in the last episode. And so Lawrence's death did come in that middle period, where one of the most heartbreaking things about it all is that he may not have needed to die. That battle that he was fighting there, that skirmish where he was actually killed, was not the game-changing moment in the war. We had already had the Battle of Yorktown, and we had not yet had the Treaty of Paris. This was basically the middle ground that if this one skirmish had been avoided, the outcome of the war probably would have been the same.
Exactly.
Which is heartbreaking.
Yeah. On August 27th, 1782, Lawrence came upon a group of British soldiers foraging for rice. He tried to apprehend them with a small force, but the enemy started shooting first, and when Lawrence got up to lead his men, he was struck by a bullet and killed.
So in the staging of this musical, we have Eliza actually narrating this entire letter to Hamilton while he's sitting at his desk. She's sitting there reading the text to him as he's there. And the lyrics that she reads at the end of this are, "The war was already over. As you know, John dreamed of emancipating and recruiting 3,000 men for the first all-black military regiment. His dream of freedom for these men dies with him."
Which I think is telling, because that's what Hamilton's afraid of happening to him. That's why he writes like he's running out of time. He doesn't want to die before his dreams can be grasped.
Unfulfilled destiny, it seems, is like a big theme to be discussed here. Like unfulfilled goals, unfulfilled dreams. Hamilton's whole message from the very beginning of the musical is that there are so many things I haven't done, but just you wait, I will do them. I will accomplish these things if you give me enough time. And at the end of the musical, Eliza says, I got what you always wanted. I ended with more time. And in this scene, John Lawrence did not get the time that he needed to accomplish his particular goals and dreams.
Right. So in the lyrics, he says, tomorrow there'll be more of us. And this is a bit of a shift, because earlier we saw that when they were talking about building up your numbers, building up the army to go to war. But this is a man who's dead singing this, tomorrow there'll be more of us. And we see in history that it's not just the actual war and the actual battles that kill people. It's the things after it, the sickness and the disease that spread and the wounds that cause people to die. Well, I think it was 6,000 to 7,000 people died fighting this war. 50,000 people will die because of the effects of the war afterwards.
Right. I love that double meaning. Well, I don't love it because it's really sad, but it's the meaning that not only were they talking about tomorrow there'll be more of the combatants early on, more of the people joining the cause early on. Now he's saying almost post-mortem, tomorrow there'll be more of us who are dying. Right. There will be more people dying for this cause. There will be more people in the entire American experiment who will actually end up on my side of the battle, that will be a casualty of war with unfulfilled destinies and out there.
So this death hits Hamilton really hard. And you see here at the end of the musical, Lin-Manuel Miranda kind of touches on this idea that Chernow expands on, that Hamilton kind of shuts himself off emotionally, and then he gets back to work. You see the last thing that he says in response to Eliza saying, Alexander, are you all right? He says, I have so much work to do. And in the staging, he gets up and turns and just marches off stage. And it's this idea of he's now cut off and he's focused on his work. But he's also redetermined himself, and he has to focus, and he knows that there's only a limited amount of time we have to get things done. and he needs to get things done.
Right. I've heard a lot of people who saw this musical comment on how there's almost no chance to respond to John Lawrence's death here. It's like you hear that he's dead. Hamilton says, I have so much to do. And then immediately it's after the war, I went back to New York after the war.
So in the staging there, as soon as he goes to walk away, he then turns immediately and says after the war, and it just like switches tone, switches everything right back into it. So it jumps right into the next song.
Yeah, you don't have a beat to cry. You don't have that chance to respond to the heartbreak that's inside of you, because Hamilton in this moment is not responding externally to that thing inside of him.
Right.
He is burying himself in work. Like you said, he is absolutely retreating from those emotions, those feelings. He says, we've got to start a new nation, got to meet my son. I have to do so many things. There's so many things on my plate that I can't deal right now.
But in history, he did have a little bit of time to respond, and he actually wrote a letter about this. And there's this nice quote from it that I'd like to read. I feel the deepest affliction at the news we have just received at the loss of our dear and inestimable friend, Lawrence. His career of virtue is at end. How strangely are human affairs conducted, that so many excellent qualities could not ensure a more happy fate. The world will feel the loss of a man who has left few like him behind, and America of a citizen whose heart realized that patriotism of which others only talk. I feel the loss of a friend whom I truly and most tenderly loved, and one of a very small number.
It's worth remembering that John Lawrence and Alexander Hamilton had one of the most intimate friendships of their entire lives with one another. There are insinuations of more than just friendship between them as two companion soldiers on Washington's staff who write to each other in very intimate language. And so you can read Ron Chernow's biography for some of those comments. But regardless, you can see some of his actual vulnerability with John Lawrence. There's a vulnerability in his correspondence with him that he's writing with incredible emotion, incredible openness, that he's always open about his policies. He's always willing to speak his mind. He's always willing to kind of say things that he maybe shouldn't have said. But with John Lawrence, he's willing to show weakness and show vulnerabilities and be really intimate with John Lawrence. If you read his correspondence, there's a level of love between the two men that they absolutely cared for one another like no other people in their lives. And so while Hamilton still does have this intimacy with Eliza throughout his correspondence throughout the rest of his life, that level of intimacy he had with Lawrence never shows up with any other friend of his in their correspondence. His writing suddenly takes a shift in tone when you analyze all of his letters together, that it never gets to the place that it was with Lawrence again with anyone else.
Yeah, to summarize some of those points you were making, Chernow says in his biography, John Lawrence's death deprived Hamilton of the political peer, the steadfast colleague that he was to need in his tempestuous battles to consolidate the Union. He would enjoy a brief collaboration with James Madison and never lacked the stalwart, if aloof, patronage of George Washington, but he was more of a solitary crusader without Lawrence, lacking an intimate lifelong ally such as Madison and Jefferson found in each other. On a personal level, the loss was even more harrowing. Despite a large circle of admirers, Hamilton did not form deep friendships easily and never again revealed his interior life to another man as he had to Lawrence. After the death of John Lawrence, Hamilton shut off some compartments of his emotions and never reopened it.
So by now, at this point in our actual podcast, we've actually gone through every tract in Act 1. Which is kind of an accomplishment for us.
Yeah.
It's kind of a nice little moment to celebrate. We do want to pause for a moment, and the rest of this episode, we're going to do something a little bit special, at least something we think is special. We like it a little bit. We want to look back at some of those characters in this act that didn't have the center stage.
Right.
So people who are mentioned on stage, but they don't actually get a solo song, or they don't get to have a moment that we actually got to highlight. And so we're going to talk about a couple of those people, and then a couple people who could have been in the musical, but because of time and constraints of other things, Lin-Manuel Miranda decided not to include them. So
some interesting stories, side notes from they're connected to the musical, but not in the musical necessarily.
Yeah, exactly. So the first of these characters is actually one who makes a lot of sense for us to discuss this way.
Yeah.
Because the musical itself introduces us to 3 Schuyler sisters, Angelica, Eliza,
and Peggy.
And all that she has in this musical is basically expressing a little bit of concern about being in the city when they shouldn't be, when their father doesn't want them to be. And then she interjects her own name as if not to be forgotten, almost highlighting the fact that she is the sister that we don't know about. She's the one that doesn't get the stage time in this musical. And she says, and Peggy, she'll push her way into the middle of them saying, I'm here, I will not be forgotten. But really, when we leave this musical, we really only remember her saying her name and Peggy. We don't really remember much about her. So let's talk a little bit about at least one moment in history when she kind of got the center stage and was really kind of fantastic.
Yeah, there's this great story about her, and we know at least parts of it to be true, the overall story to be true, but there's some folklore involved possibly about some of the details that happen that I find fascinating and I choose to believe happened.
Yeah, exactly. So the story itself happened. It's historical. You can look into Ron Chernow for his description of this, and you can look online and find a lot of different articulations of those details. And the big picture idea is that essentially the Schuyler family is locked up at their home, and they are about to be attacked. They are under an attack by these Native Americans and these loyalists who are closing in on their house, and they're taking guns. They're basically laying siege to the mansion in order to take away all of their goods, to fight the people that are there, and to take over the mansion itself.
And Eliza and Angelica are actually here and pregnant at the time.
Exactly. They're both too pregnant to be involved in any kind of combat situation. Yeah. Like, they shouldn't be involved in this, but they are they're basically hiding, pregnant, and they are upstairs, and they hear that people are bursting down the doors in the basement, bursting onto the scene in the main house, and they're trying to stay quiet, stay away from the danger, because they're up in the rooms. And they know what soldiers will do to them if they are caught and if they're captured. They're fearing for the worst. And so Eliza and Angelica, as pregnant women, are up there, and their little sister Peggy is with them in that room. And what happens?
So also Philip Schuyler and Mrs. Schuyler are up there as well. And they actually realize they left the infant few-month-old baby of Mrs. Schuyler downstairs. And the chaos and the commotion of a gun being shot and the alarm being raised, they rushed upstairs and they left the baby downstairs. And these people are coming in. So first, Mrs. Schuyler is going to rush down there, but Philip stops her and is like, you can't do that. And Peggy rushes past, knowing that her other sisters are pregnant and they can't do it. So she rushes down there to grab this child, and she picks up the infant and tries to rush up the stairs. And as she does, one of the intruders hurls a tomahawk at her.
Right.
Yeah. And supposedly it goes really close to her head and really close to the baby's head and cuts into her dress slightly as it slams into the stairs railing.
Right. This is hardcore. Like, she's just running behind enemy lines, going down there, putting her life on the line to save this child.
Yeah.
To save her little sister, Catherine.
Yeah. And it's just this amazing act of bravery as she's running up the stairs. You just see it like an action movie.
Yeah, of course. I'd love to see that in an action movie.
Supposedly, the scar of the tomahawk is still in the railing if you visit the house today.
Oh, fascinating.
So she is coming up the stairs, and she actually runs into the man who is leading the raid at this point. And he thinks she's a servant. So he says, "Wench, where is your master?"
Oh, snap.
And she...
You don't talk like that to a Schuyler sister.
Being quick thinking, because she's a Schuyler sister, says, "Oh, he went to town to alert everybody."
Nice. Well done, Peggy.
At which point, the guy leading the raid goes downstairs to confer with the people there and see what they should do. And I'm assuming here, I couldn't find anything that said this was true. I'm assuming she goes upstairs and tells her father what happened. And then what I read is that her father opens the windows and yells outside as if he is outside, commanding a bunch of people, "We have the house surrounded. Let's get them."
I love that. It's classic. Let's convince them that we have the numbers, even though we're the outnumbered ones.
Yeah. So the intruders hear this, think that the house is surrounded, and take off out the back and run away.
It's perfect. It's perfect.
Such a great story.
I love that.
We don't know if the details in there are all true, but it's so cool.
Yeah, and it's a shining, stellar moment for Peggy. And yeah, I think it's great. From one Schuyler sister to a man who married into the Schuyler family, our next big character that we've talked about a little bit in the song Nonstop is going to be John Barker Church. So this is a guy that Angelica was talking about when she said that I'm sailing off to London with someone who always pays. He's not a lot of fun, but there's no one who can match Hamilton for his turn of phrase and his wit and his antics in that. But John Barker Church is her husband. And remember, we discussed how Angelica and John actually eloped because Philip Schuyler did not approve of their wedding. Right. Like John Barker Church didn't bring a lot of things to the table early on. Later on, he becomes someone in this life. He makes something out of his life.
Yeah.
But early on, Philip Schuyler is not looking at this guy and saying, well, I think you can provide for my daughter. I think you have what it takes to take over the family name, like to continue our legacy well. But he doesn't approve. Angelica puts it to him and says, I'm going to marry him anyway. Marry that guy, marry him anyways. You know, like she's confident. She's going to do this thing, no matter what her father says. So John Barker Church, Angelica Schuyler, they get married. They have some babies. They go off to London. What do we want to talk about with John Barker Church today?
So there's actually an interesting story with John Barker Church and Aaron Burr, who happen to have had a duel before Burr duels Hamilton, for almost the same reason.
Yeah, and that's kind of a big deal because the man who ends up murdering Alexander Hamilton in the streets actually has a duel early on with his brother-in-law, which is such a, that's a big deal. That's a huge detail that you could skip over, especially in a musical that has 3 actual duels in it.
Yeah.
We have one with Charles Lee, one with Philip Hamilton, and then another with the big Hamilton duel at the end. But here, John Barker Church instigates a duel with Aaron Burr, and they decide to, they go back and forth, try to do some resolution, and they go through the 10 duel commandments to set things up. And that could have been a detail inside of this particular musical, but because John Church is not really a character that they wanted to develop, they wanted to, I assume, Lin-Manuel Miranda wanted to highlight the Lawrence-Hamilton relationship and the Lee versus Washington conflict early on, so that he made a good decision for the text of the musical. It was really good. Yeah. But this is also a fascinating detail.
Yeah, so John Church had accused Burr of some things in this banking business that they were into at the moment.
Yeah, the Bank of Manhattan or Chase Manhattan Bank.
And it led to them dueling over it, which you got to kind of think, how many duels is Burr going to have to challenge people to because they're standing there before he realizes he might be doing something wrong? I don't know. That's not a historical comment.
Right.
So there is some discrepancy here between what guns they used. But historically, if you follow the code of dueling, then Church would have used his own guns. And these would happen to be the same guns that later Hamilton would use in his duel with Burr.
Right. Alexander Hamilton actually borrowed his brother-in-law's pistols when they wanted to do this combat.
Yeah, in Aaron Burr's memoirs, he says that he supplied the guns for this particular duel.
Right, the Church duel.
Which would have broken the code, and there's a lot of historians that argue over that, apparently.
Right, and that's neither here nor there. The big deal is that this duel was instigated and did actually take place.
Yeah, so both of them missed their shot. No one ends up getting injured here, and Church apologizes for the way that he went about talking about Burr and his possible misdoings.
And that apology satisfied Aaron.
Yeah.
Like Aaron Burr is actually not going to force the duel any further. They're not going to take a second shot at each other. They basically nod at each other's honor and say, I respect you. You showed up at the field of honor. You've apologized to me. And so let's part ways, do our own thing. And they remained business partners for a little bit. And so.
Right. And it's also kind of fitting that most of the information that we have about Church involving this musical is about dueling. He also helped Philip plan his duel where he ends up getting shot and killed.
Right. Yeah. So in the second act of our musical, Philip Hamilton looks to his father and says, hey, this is my first duel. They don't exactly cover this in boarding school. But it wasn't him going to his father. Historically, there may have been some actual conversation between Philip and his father, Alexander, but we do know that John Barker Church was actually helping his nephew, Philip Hamilton, set this up, help him go through the process of what are you going to do to challenge George Eaker.
And that brings us to our next person, Lafayette. No.
But not that one.
Not that Lafayette.
Connected to him.
So James Armistead Lafayette was a slave, and he volunteered, with permission, to join the army under Lafayette. Our Lafayette from here in the musical and history, who'd utilized him as a spy. He would pose as a runaway slave, and join, actually, the camp of Benedict Arnold, who we're going to be talking about soon.
Oh, yeah.
And he earned Benedict Arnold's trust and got some sway there. And then he would move on from camp to camp, and he would basically overhear their plans and their strategies, write them down, and then get them to other spies to take to the colonial armies.
Yeah, and he was able to maneuver to a lot of these different areas without a lot of suspicion being cast upon him because he was a person of color in the Revolutionary era.
Right.
And so he was able to get into certain places without really being seen, without being paid attention to, and he used that to his advantage, and he worked very closely with our friend, the Marquis de Lafayette.
And the information he was able to get from the British was instrumental in the Battle of Yorktown. This guy was a war hero for the spying that he did. And actually, by Virginia law, he should have been freed as a slave for being a soldier in the war in 1783. However, there was a loophole that being a spy isn't the same as being a soldier, apparently.
Oh, man, that's so lame.
So they wouldn't grant him his freedom.
Yeah, that's terrible.
Fortunately, the Marquis de Lafayette was not going to take that sitting down, and he wrote a recommendation saying, you need to free this guy.
Right. So the Marquis de Lafayette, our hero from this particular musical, the immigrant you know and love who's unafraid to step in, steps in and defends our man here who has fought for this country, who has done his job in really dangerous situations, doing the spying that he needed to do. Marquis de Lafayette looks at him and he says, I will write you a letter of recommendation. I will petition the actual legislators of Virginia to give them your due diligence, to give them what you are rightly entitled to under this cause, because Lafayette himself was dedicated to the cause of freedom. And when he saw that there was this other man who was fighting for it, who did not get the benefits of it, he didn't stand by that. He was not okay with it at all.
Yeah. And so James Armistead was freed.
Mm-hmm.
And out of gratitude to the Marquis de Lafayette, he took his name. He took the name Lafayette.
Exactly. So as they're signing the free paperwork, he is able to select how he wants to be named now, how he wants to take this name, and he takes, out of an honoring position, he takes Lafayette's name, and it's just a beautiful story about their camaraderie, their respect for one another, and our immigrant that we know and love, how he was able to stand up for another man's rights, and how this person is able to continue that person's legacy because they were so respectful of each other.
Right.
And it's a beautiful, beautiful story.
Yeah, and a quick story that I read, when Lafayette, the Marquis de Lafayette, comes back to visit America, he's going through, and in the crowds, he actually sees James Armistead Lafayette and has the carriage stopped. He's like, stop, and gets out and runs and embraces him. And that just shows like he loved this guy. He was for this guy and wanted good things for him. He loved what he did for our country.
That's beautiful. I love that. I hadn't heard that detail. So we have two more characters from history that we want to discuss. The second one is one you've already heard of, Benedict Arnold. And the first one may or may not have existed. Right. And we don't really, there's so many different textbooks out there, so many different positions on her, so many different ideas. Her story, though, is important. Her legend is important. And her legend came up at the Battle of Monmouth, where we know our guy Hamilton was at. It was the whole conflict with Charles Lee. You see that this particular battle gave rise to a heroine of the Revolutionary War, Molly Pitcher.
Right. And Molly Pitcher is just a nickname given to describe someone that, like we said, may or may not have existed. And there are a few historical characters that they'll try to put that name on, but we don't know for sure.
Right. It might be a conglomerate of all these different people, Captain Molly, other people, other names in general that might have been involved.
So, but the story goes that she was carrying water to the troops, and that's possibly where the name Molly Pitcher comes from.
Right.
It was a title of what she was doing. She was carrying this water to the troops in battle, and it was very hot out, like over 100-degree weather. Mm-hmm. And the story kind of differs. Either her husband got shot and killed or something while he was at the cannon, or he collapsed in his exhaustion in the heat. And she decided, well, I'm just not going to carry water. I'm going to take over his cannon. So she starts arming the cannon and firing the cannon. And as she's doing so, of course, she's being fired upon. And at one point, a cannon from the British side comes flying toward her and goes in between her legs, tearing through her skirt. And the story goes that she looks down almost unconcerned and says, well, that could have been worse. There was a soldier who wrote a memoir later and mentioned it, who said that it happened and it went right between her legs and she was unconcerned, and had said later, if it had gone just a little bit higher, I might have lost something more. Right.
Of course, this particular letter was a few decades after the actual confrontation, the actual battle. So some people cast a lot of doubt on that, a lot of questions are raised. Like there's not a lot that you can really hang your hat on in this story for sure.
Yeah.
What we know for a fact is that there were several hundred women who were either on the battlefield or close at hand. They called them camp followers, women who followed the army around, and they assisted with kind of the logistics of everyday living, so to speak. Like they would,
Right.
on normal days when there wasn't an actual battle happening, they would cook or they would wash the clothes. They would kind of help carry things along, and they would be like nurses during the battle. They would be carrying supplies to and from the line often. And like you were talking about, like they would, like Molly would have been carrying pitchers of water to different people. And in some versions of the legend, she gets her name because people are saying, Molly, over here, pitcher, we need a pitcher of water. Molly, pitcher, Molly, pitcher. And that's just the cry that's coming from the battlefield as they're calling Molly, pitcher, and they start talking to her. Lots of people think that this might have been Molly Hayes or Mary Hayes. There could have been any three Hayeses that were in the Revolutionary War that she could have been married to, that could have been the guy who fell at the cannon. There are historical situations of women actually picking up muskets to start firing at the enemies. There are historical records of different women who actually were involved in this particular combat, but we really have a lot of questions that are raised about the validity of the Molly Pitcher legend.
Right. And one of the sources I had read was talking about how Washington heard about what she did and honored her with a title, and she was known as Sergeant Molly after that. But of course, that might not be historically accurate there.
Right. So what we get with this character is we don't really know, like, at the end of the day, we're not going to solve the questions of her actual historical validity here. Like, we're not going to be able to solve this on our podcast, sadly. As smart as you may be, Vinton, we may not actually come into the final decision on this because lots of writers have said different things about it.
Exactly. But I choose to believe it's true. Hashtag Team Molly Pitcher.
Team Molly Pitcher. Nice.
That brings us to our final person for this podcast.
Right. So this particular character is one whose absence from this musical is actually a little striking. If you know about the Revolutionary War and you know about the events that led up to it, you've heard the name Benedict Arnold.
Right.
If you grew up in the American school systems, in most places, you've heard about this name. It's synonymous with a traitor.
Yeah.
Someone who is going to betray you, someone who you considered a close friend. Like, this is the Julius Caesar et Brute situation, where this was a close general who was working with George Washington. He was actually an American hero who was given a lot of charge. If it weren't for his contributions to the American side, the American Revolution probably would have ended a lot earlier.
Yeah, he was a great military mind who did a lot of great things.
So to give you a little running start into Benedict Arnold's story, he was a fourth generation of Arnolds who had lived here. His family came into Rhode Island and then Connecticut. As a boy, he was an adventurer in the style of Huckleberry Finn often. Like, he was running through the woods, hunting and fishing, and he would often challenge and dare his fellow boys that he was playing with to kind of dive from higher distances into the lake and jump off of cliffs or trees into the water. And to foreshadow his career as a military strategist, he also arranged a lot of these mock battles with his fellow friends in the woods when they would kind of hide in the forest and then ambush one another a little bit. I can only assume that these games were a lot like Capture the Flag or something like that we would play in the woods when we try to like sneak up on each other and have some like little fun interactions there. And as a child, his parents actually sent him to a pretty fancy academy, a respected school for a while. And at a certain point, their family was strapped for cash. They couldn't actually afford what they needed. And so they had to take him out of school so that he could become a pharmacist, which was really weird when I saw that, because like when you think of pharmacy today, you think of how you have to go to school to be a pharmacist.
Yeah.
Guys, do not accept drugs from people who do not have a degree like that. Like, don't do that. It's bad. Stay in school. But Benedict Arnold could not afford that, so his parents apprenticed him to a druggist, to a pharmacist who was able to teach him the trade, who would train him up. He lived with the Lathrop family for a while. The doctor and his wife raised him up. And as a young man, twice he actually ran off as a teenager to fight with the British in the French and Indian War. And so he actually like went off and did this on his own.
Yeah.
And he was always called back both of those times by his mother, who called him back and said, look, you're too young. You shouldn't be fighting. You just come back home. Finally, when he was apprenticing under the Lathrop family, Dr. Lathrop allowed him to go enlist finally. And so he enlisted in the French and Indian War. He was going to fight on the British side, fighting for the colonies. And right before going to battle, the day before he was supposed to rush into battle with his particular troop, he heard that his mother was ill. And he heard that his mother was dying. And he risked execution by abandoning his unit, abandoning his post dishonorably the day before the battle to rush home to see his mama. So this is a much more sympathetic precursor to the later way when an older Benedict Arnold will actually leave his post and run away from the soldiers. But here, as a child, he kind of sets that precursor to it where he is running from his post and goes home and tends to his family duties. And he stays with his mom. His mom eventually does die.
Of yellow fever.
Right. Teenage Benedict Arnold took it really hard.
Yeah.
It devastated him.
So did his father, who would be arrested repeatedly for drunkenness until his death.
Yeah.
He just grieved and never got over it.
Yeah, his father was a captain in the military, and he became the town drunk. Like, everyone's talking about him. There was at least one time when teenage Benedict Arnold had to carry his father home from the taverns, and it's so depressing. He had to grow up really quickly. So Benedict Arnold, as a teenager, becomes an adult, basically. After his father does pass away, he opens a store selling medicine and selling books, and the things he's learned to trade, he actually starts to sell those in a storefront.
Yeah.
Fast forwarding through the next phases of his life, eventually taxation became a big deal and kind of a theme in the colonies, and taxes made it a little bit harder to own the store, so Benedict Arnold became a trader of goods. He sailed ships to the West Indies, to England, and brought things back, and so our notorious trader of American history becomes a trader of goods and services. And when the British taxes started to grow, so did the profession of smuggler. And so Benedict Arnold became a smuggler before he became a military hero. It's worth noting that at this point in time, smuggling wasn't actually an inherent evil to them.
Yeah, he joined the Sons of Liberty.
Yes. He was fighting for the revolutionary side, the colonists. They saw it as a clever way to avoid unjust taxation.
Exactly.
As a sidebar, we'll probably get to talk a little bit more about the smuggling issue in Act 2, because Hamilton's job is to stimulate, facilitate, and regulate the new country's economy. He's the Treasury Secretary, and so he decides that he has to actually build lighthouses and establish the Coast Guard, in part to guard against smuggling and piracy that would basically undermine the country's stability financially.
Yeah.
And so he is... Like, smuggling became a big profession when the British were in charge. Now that America in the second act has their own country, they have to fight against that smuggling that might undermine them. So anyways, all that to be said, Benedict Arnold has come a long ways. He's gone through a lot of things. He's overcome a lot of trials, a lot of bad situations, and he becomes a military general on the continental side.
Right.
So as a general in the continental cause, fighting for the Americans, he went through a lot of major combats. He was in Quebec. He was in a lot of these different big, decisive battles that were important. He had some losses, some wins, some victories. There's a 45-minute documentary I saw on, I think it's the History Channel's website. We can link to it in the show notes for all of you to watch this if you're interested in Benedict Arnold's history. But one of the historians that they interviewed says, if a musket ball at Saratoga, at the Battle of Saratoga, had entered his heart rather than his leg, because he was shot and injured in the leg, but if it had entered his heart instead, he would have died a great hero of the American cause. Yeah. We'd have schools named after him. We'd have cities named after him. Maybe instead of having Washington State, we'd have an actual Arnold State.
Yeah, it's really like interesting to think about. If he had died early, he would have been a hero.
Right, but something happened that absolutely changed the course of how we remember him in American history. Benedict Arnold was in charge of the forces at West Point. West Point was known as the key to the continent, this area that if you controlled West Point, you controlled basically the Hudson River, and it was a huge strategic advantage in the military strategy. And basically, Benedict Arnold wasn't happy with how he was compensated by the war efforts.
Yeah.
He thought that the Congress wasn't wasn't compensating him enough for what he had done, wasn't respecting him enough. He didn't have enough authority, enough power, and enough, he wasn't compensated as much as he should have been. And so he delivered West Point's military plans to the British officers and He basically was paid £20,000 from what I saw, and he was promised a British command should he ever be discovered.
Yeah, he had basically convinced Washington to give him command over West Point by using his leg as an excuse, because Washington was going to send him somewhere else. But he was like, oh, well, I'm injured. What about this one? Because that was the one that the British had said, hey, give us that. And so he actually tricked Washington into getting that command so that he could be over that and so he could deliver it over, basically.
Right. So that is a huge, huge betrayal. You can imagine how personally Washington took that when one of his closest staff members, one of his closest generals, absolutely stabbed him in the back.
Yeah. One of the historical records I was reading says that he talked to Lafayette about it and said, Benedict Arnold has betrayed us. Who can we trust?
Yes, exactly. So connecting this back to our musical at hand, it's worth noting that Hamilton, who had this strange knack for showing up at all of these key moments of American history,
Right.
He actually was there the very morning that Benedict Arnold's betrayal became known.
Yeah.
So Hamilton and one other aide from Washington were sent ahead to Benedict Arnold's house, and they were taking breakfast there when a letter was delivered to Benedict Arnold in front of Hamilton, and they remember looking at Arnold's face and seeing the color flush from it. Seeing he gets nervous, he gets scared.
Yeah.
The content of this letter basically is that someone has discovered your scout or a scout with detailed plans for the fortresses around West Point with detailed information. And so they were delivering it to him saying, you need to be aware of the fact that someone has been discovered with these plans. There's a traitor in your midst. And so his color is watching from his face. He knows that he is about to be discovered. He needs to get out of there before Washington arrives for sure, before the army actually discovers everything that happens. So Arnold runs upstairs, talks to his wife, who had actually been in on the trading.
Yeah.
She was
in on it.
She was absolutely in on it. And so he talks to her. They make a quick little plan. He runs and gets away from the house. And Hamilton thinks it's a little bit odd because he looked so stressed out. He looked a little bit perplexed. And then he runs like he has to excuse himself from breakfast so quickly. It's a little odd. Washington shows up. They have their meal. They talk about it a little bit, find out what was in the letter. And then they confront Arnold's wife.
Yeah. And she basically feigns emotional distress, almost an insanity, as a way to avoid them accusing her of being in on it, to show, I wasn't on this. I'm emotionally distressed. This is too much for me. I can't deal with it, so that she won't be found out that she was in on it.
Exactly. Ron Chernow has this quote that I've heard him say in a couple of his lectures about Hamilton, where he says that Hamilton's IQ was incredibly, incredibly high, but it dropped about 50 points anytime he was around a pretty lady.
Right.
Like every time in his life when he's around a pretty woman, he stops thinking. He starts just listening. He doesn't analyze the situation. So he's in the room with Mrs. Arnold and George Washington, and they're interviewing her. And Mrs. Arnold is basically freaking out, and she's saying, I'm not going to let you kill my baby, Washington. I'm not going to let you kill my baby, Hamilton. I'm not going to let... And they're like, I'm not here to touch your child. This is not what we're trying to help you. And they're just... She freaks out. She's acting the part incredibly well.
Yeah.
Hamilton actually writes back to his wife, Eliza, at home, and he talks about this and says it was the most affecting moment of his life when he saw that this woman was incredibly grieved and incredibly troubled. And he thinks there's no way she could have been a part of Benedict Arnold's betrayal. And so she gets off easy.
Yeah, she pretends to be so emotionally distraught that she is basically has no sense of reality, no sense of truth. She's completely lost her mind over it.
Yeah, so it's a fascinating little detail of how that particular betrayal was unfolding in the middle of Hamilton's presence. So that interaction, I would have loved to see Lin-Manuel Miranda's take on it. I'd love to see a little deleted scene from the musical one day where he maybe is able to add a little extra thing and maybe give us a little bit of a rap about what Benedict Arnold might have done in that setting. I'd love to see a rapping Benedict Arnold. That'd be great. It'd be so much fun.
Maybe we'll have a sequel.
Maybe. That'd be fun. So to this day, the name Benedict is much more popular in Great Britain than it is in America because we don't want to name our kids after the biggest traitor in American history.
Sure.
I think Benedict Cumberbatch might be bringing the name back, though.
Bringing it back.
He's kind of amazing. He is brilliant. And so with that, we've wrapped up all of the characters we wanted to discuss in this particular episode.
Yeah.
This has been a fun thing for us.
Yes.
We've kind of uncovered a lot of different stories as we read through our different biographies, as we research the life and times of Alexander Hamilton for this musical. It's been a ton of fun. We would love it if you would send us some interesting stories you've heard.
Yeah.
Like things that may or may not interact with Hamilton's life, things that happened in the Revolutionary War that you think is just neat. If you find an article to link to us or a story that you can share with us, we would love to hear about it. If you have just names you want to tweet at us, say, hey, look at this person in history and tell us what you think about them. We love doing that. So we took this 10th episode in our podcast about the $10 founding father in order to share some of those stories that we thought were fascinating with you. I hope you've enjoyed that.
Yeah, so if you do want to send us some of those stories, email us at contact@graphocast.com, the Graphomania Twitter @Graphocast, or our personal Twitters. I'm @FleshEater.
And I'm @Alpha Knight.
And we'd love to hear from you. So we'd also like to thank everyone for writing reviews for us. We've gotten a lot of really good reviews recently.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And
You're so kind.
Yeah, we had a deal going on where we would write you a rap and put it online if you would write a review for us. And we did a few of those already.
Right.
They're already online. And there's a few more coming. So if you still haven't gotten your rap for the review that you wrote, please send us an email or tweet at us and let us know. Because there's a few of you that we don't know who actually wrote them. So we don't know what to write about you.
Exactly. But we will be releasing a few more this week, and so be on the lookout for that on our SoundCloud. We'll be tweeting it, or we'll send it to you. However you reach out to us, we'll be able to get it to you.
Right. But that special is over now. We're not going to be doing that from here on out. We're actually doing a new thing. We're launching our Patreon page for the Graphomania Podcast Network. Podcasting isn't free. It does cost money to do this every week, and it takes a lot of time and effort, and there are expenses involved. So if you enjoyed this podcast and other podcasts on the network, we would ask that you would check out our Patreon page and think about giving maybe just $1 a month. As little as $1 a month will give you access to special
exclusive content
that we do on the feed. We're going to be doing at least one special monthly show, and then I might put up some extras on top of that as well. And there's going to be a $10 a month level, and that's the $10 founding father Hamilton level. And in that tier, we're going to do some kind of special Hamilton recording specifically for you.
Right, and we'll give you more details about that in a future episode, but we really are getting excited about this, and so I hope that you will join us and be on the board with that.
So patreon.com/Graphocast, patreon.com/GRAPHOCAST. Next week, we're going to be jumping back into Act 2 of our beloved Hamilton musical. Until then, I'm Vinton Bayne.
And I'm Robbie Hurlocker. Thanks for listening.
Hi, I'm Sean Hancock.
And I'm Missy Hancock.
And I'm Vinton Bayne.
Together we are the Hancock Creative Podcast.
And we have a mission to encourage your creative soul. So we ask that you would come check out our weekly podcast and weekly pep talks, specially designed to encourage you.
The Hancock Creative Podcast is part of the Graphomania Podcast Network and can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, or at graphocast.com, GRAPHOCAST.com.